Hello everyone. Welcome back to the series of lectures in hematology. Today we'll be looking at a different aspect of hematology, which is non-immune hemolysis. So under the chapter on hemolytic anemias, we had learned about hereditary causes for hemolysis. Then we've learned about acquired causes, especially autoimmune hemolytic anemias. And now we'll be continuing with non-immune hemolysis. So what are the causes for non-immune hemolysis? So what do you mean by non-immune hemolysis exactly? It means that there is a hemolytic anemia which is triggered, which is not due to the presence of autoantibodies. So there is no immunological background to it, right? So the AIHA is basically an immune hemolytic anemia where there are autoantibodies which are produced against the RBCs. In non-immune hemolysis, there is no evidence of autoantibodies. So what you have to remember is that non-immune hemolysis can be due to infections, it can be due to drugs. Then we have PNH and fragmentation hemolysis. So what are the infections which can lead to non-immune hemolysis? We have malaria and babesia, which are parasitic infections which can cause hemolysis, which we are well aware of. Then we have drugs causing hemolysis, which includes dapsone, trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole, primaquine. Okay, fine. What is PNH? PNH basically stands for paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria. So this is one of the causes for non-immune hemolysis and we'll be discussing it in detail in the further slides. Then we have fragmentation hemolysis where due to unknown reasons there can be fragmentation of the RBCs. Right? So what are the different types of fragmentation hemolysis? That also we will be looking at now. So let us start off with PNH. PNH basically stands for paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria. So this is basically a disorder where there is a chronic intravascular hemolysis. Okay, so there is a chronic intravascular hemolysis. So whenever there is intravascular hemolysis, what will happen? There will be hemoglobinuria. Okay, so you will have hemoglobinuria and hence the patient's predominant complaint will be passage of frank blood in the urine. Okay, so this is non-immune hemolysis where you have chronic intravascular hemolysis, and PNH, you know, when we spoke about the classification of hemolytic anemias, it is a cause of acquired hemolytic anemia. So this is a cause of acquired hemolytic anemia. And we know that most of the acquired hemolytic anemias are due to an extracorpuscular defect, correct? So if you speak about acquired hemolytic anemias like autoimmune hemolytic anemias, where is the defect? The defect is because of autoantibodies against the RBCs which are extracorpuscular. It is not intracorpuscular, unlike your hereditary hemolytic anemias like hereditary spherocytosis where there is a cytoskeleton defect, or in your enzymopathies like G6PD where there is a deficiency of enzyme within the RBCs. So you have to remember that PNH is classified as an exception because it is a cause of acquired hemolytic anemia, but the defect is still an intracorpuscular defect. Alright, clear. Now, let us understand the pathogenesis and what exactly happens in this PNH. So, the mutation is what is called as the mutation of the PIGA gene. Okay, so what is the function of this PIGA gene? Now, this PIGA gene is found in the X chromosome. Okay, where is the PIGA gene found? It is found in the X chromosome. Alright, now what is the function of this gene? The main function of the gene is that it helps in the production of complement regulatory proteins. So it helps in the production of complement regulatory proteins. So what is the role of the complement regulatory proteins? So if we consider this is the blood vessel, and what do you find within that? You find RBCs. Now normally when you speak about the immune system, we all know from our basic microbiology that we have a complement cascade pathway, right? So normally will these complements react against the RBCs? No, we have complements in the blood, but they will not react against our own RBCs. And what is the reason for that? That is because of this presence of these complement regulatory proteins which inhibit the action of complements to the RBCs. which means that the complement regulatory proteins are going to protect the RBCs. They are going to protect the RBCs from what? From complement mediated lysis. Okay, so this is the basic function of the complement regulatory proteins which are produced by the PIGA gene. Okay, so what are the two complement regulatory proteins that we should be knowing of? It is CD55 and CD59. CD55 stands for decay accelerating factor or DAF, and CD59 is membrane inhibitor of reactive lysis or MIRL. Okay, so these are the two important complement regulatory proteins which are found in the RBCs and which prevent a complement mediated lysis of the RBCs. Okay, fine. Now what happens in PNH is that there is a defect in the function of these complement mediated proteins. Now because of this defect in the function of these complement regulatory proteins, what happens is that there is a complement mediated damage to the RBCs resulting in hemolysis. Okay, so this becomes very clear, and the key terms that you have to remember is PIGA gene, X chromosome, CD55 and CD59. Alright, clear. So what are the other functions of your PIGA gene? Okay, so PIGA gene is involved in the production of neutrophil alkaline phosphatase. It is also involved in the production of urokinase plasminogen activator receptor or UPAR. Okay, so when this PIGA gene is going to get affected, so UPAR also will be affected, and this causes a predisposition to thrombosis. Alright, so UPAR protein is affected and you will have predisposition to thrombosis in PNH. So what is the basic pathophysiology behind PNH? So in PNH you have PIGA gene mutation. So if the PIGA gene is mutated, then you don't have the activity of CD55 and CD59, which are the complement regulatory proteins, and hence you have complement mediated lysis of RBCs. Okay, so this results in your hemolysis, and also the other function is the UPAR, which is protective, which is anticoagulant in nature. Since that is also affected, there is a predisposition to thrombosis, and you can have thrombosis in different parts of the body. Okay, so this is very clear. Now let us look at the clinical features of paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria. So first is, of course, this is a hemolysis, and what type of hemolysis you will have? You will have an intravascular hemolysis. You will have an intravascular hemolysis. So you will have recurrent episodes of intravascular hemolysis, which will be characterized by recurrent passage of blood in urine because of hemoglobinuria and hemosideриnuria. Okay, so this is very clear, right? Now, can you have extravascular hemolysis in PNH? Yes, you can have extravascular hemolysis in PNH. Predominantly in chronic forms, you can have extravascular hemolysis, predominantly because of activation of a C3 mediated complement pathway, which basically causes damage of RBCs and sequestration of RBCs in the spleen and resulting in an extravascular hemolysis. So these patients can present with splenomegaly, they can present with gallbladder pigment gallstones. Okay, because some component of extravascular hemolysis can also be there. Then because of mutations associated with UPAR, you can have thrombosis, and the most common site where you have thrombosis is presentation like an acute Budd-Chiari syndrome because of hepatic vein thrombosis. Okay, so a site is abdominal pain, acute Budd-Chiari, but it predisposes to thrombosis in various other parts, including mesenteric thrombosis, cerebral venous thrombosis, and so on. Alright, and some types of PNH can be associated with pancytopenia, and some of it can be associated with an aplastic anemia type of feature. Okay, so this is what we actually call as a triad of PNH, characterized by hemolysis, thrombosis, and pancytopenia. Okay, fine. So let us look at the diagnosis of paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria. So when will you suspect it? A young male presenting with recurrent episodes of passage of blood in the urine, and this hemoglobinuria is usually more common in the mornings. It is more common in the mornings because the pH generally becomes acidotic. The pH of the blood becomes generally acidotic and it predisposed to more hemolysis overnight, and they wake up in the morning, early morning, first sample of urine, they pass large amount of blood, and this is generally a very alarming feature to the patient, and they immediately present to the hospital. Okay. So this is when you will classically suspect a PNH, and other causes include a presentation similar to pancytopenia or thrombosis. So how will you diagnose? You will definitely find evidence of anemia in the CBC workup, right? Then you will find evidence of hemolysis in the form of indirect hyperbilirubinemia on the LFT. Okay, you will find evidence of indirect hyperbilirubinemia. Okay, then what are the other features of predominantly your hemolysis? You can have raised LDH. You can have a raised LDH, and you may find evidence of hemoglobinuria in the urine when you subject it to a centrifuge. But the test of choice for the diagnosis of PNH is flow cytometry. So what do you find in a flow cytometry? The flow cytometry basically identifies the CD55 and CD59 complement regulatory proteins. So if you subject these cells or your peripheral sample to a flow for PNH, so you see a scatter plot, right? So the basic principle of a flow cytometry is that it is basically based on the scatter of these particles to light. Correct? So in a patient of PNH, you find that there is loss of both CD55 and CD59, and the scatter plot is negative for both, and this is the gold standard or the test of choice for PNH. So you do a flow cytometry. Apart from that, you may require a bone marrow examination, and bone marrow may show evidence of aplastic anemia, or it may show evidence of pancytopenia. Okay, you may show evidence of pancytopenia. So all of the cell lines may be reduced. Okay, fine. Now let us move on to the treatment of PNH, right? So up to 2008, the treatment of PNH was considered to be something that is a very, very difficult task. But in 2008, we found that after identifying the pathways which are involved in PNH, we found that a complement 5 inhibitor, eculizumab, can be used. Okay, so the eculizumab is basically a drug which is a complement C5 inhibitor, which is used in the management of PNH, and in fact many of the patients are actually doing much better on eculizumab. But eculizumab may require frequent infusions of maybe twice or thrice a week, and then we found another drug which is ravulizumab, which is basically a longer acting drug, right? So this requires administration only once in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. But we found that when you look at the pathway, let us understand this, that in a normal individual, the CD55 and CD59, which are the complement regulatory proteins, are intact in the blood, and hence they do not have a complement mediated lysis, right? But in a PNH patient, what happens? There is no CD55, CD59, there is formation of membrane attack complex, the complement mediated lysis happens, right? So eculizumab and ravulizumab are the drugs which basically inhibit this C5S convertase, and formation of membrane attack complex is inhibited, and hence there is no hemolysis. It inhibits the hemolysis. Okay, that is clear. But what happens is that over the course of time, we found out that the C3 mediated alternative complement pathway can be activated, and this in fact stimulates the macrophages, and it can result in extravascular hemolysis. So when you give eculizumab, you can inhibit the intravascular hemolytic pathway, but the extravascular hemolysis is still happening basically because of a C3 mediated lysis, and hence we found that certain newer drugs are useful, especially in a PNH patient, for C3 blockade. Okay, so what are those drugs? The drugs which act on the C3 pathway, which includes the factor D, factor B inhibitors, danicopan and iptacopan, and even more proximal to that, we have the pegcetacoplan. Okay, so these are the newer drugs which are used in the management of paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria. Clear? So this is about PNH, which is a non-immune hemolysis. Now let us understand what is fragmentation hemolysis, which is another type of non-immune hemolysis. Okay, so fragmentation hemolysis, as the name suggests, what happens here? There is fragmentation of RBCs, and the two types which you should know includes MAHA, which stands for microangiopathic hemolytic anemia. There is microangiopathic hemolytic anemia, and we have read this in our nephrology chapter, TMA, which stands for thrombotic microangiopathy. Thrombotic microangiopathy. So, in thrombotic microangiopathy, the small vessels of the kidney are predominantly affected. In microangiopathic hemolytic anemia, the hemolysis can happen in the larger vessels as well. So, what exactly is the reason for this fragmentation hemolysis? So, what happens is that whenever there is an injury, probably an endothelial injury due to many causes, maybe an infection, maybe drug, maybe malignancy. So, whenever there is an endothelial injury, this is the endothelium of the vessel, there is an endothelial injury, and what happens due to the endothelial injury is that there is increased production of von Willebrand factor multimers. There is increased production of von Willebrand factor multimers, which results in platelet clumping, and platelet clumping results in thrombocytopenia, and this damage also causes activation of hemolysis, and hence there is a decrease in hemoglobin as well as consumptive platelet reduction. Okay, so this is the basic principle behind your microangiopathic hemolytic anemia, which occurs as a result of endothelial injury, and this is what is called as fragmentation hemolysis. So, when you see the peripheral blood smear in fragmentation hemolysis, you find that the RBCs are broken down, they are fragmented, and this is what we call as schistocytes. Okay, so very important is that presence of schistocytes in the peripheral smear is indicative of microangiopathic hemolytic anemia, and most often MAHA patients usually are very sick, and hence you always have to look for schistocytes, and presence of schistocytes should be taken as an alarm sign. Okay, fine. So, let us look at the etiologies of microangiopathic hemolytic anemia. So, what are the etiologies? So, that includes hemolytic uremic syndrome. Then, what is TTP? Thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura. What is CAPS? It stands for catastrophic APS, catastrophic antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. And then we have your HELP syndrome, which you see in severe eclampsia, right? So, this stands for hemolysis, elevated liver function test, and low platelet count, HELP syndrome, which you see in eclampsia. Okay, so these are the most important etiologies for microangiopathic hemolytic anemia. Remember HUS, TTP, catastrophic APS, and HELP syndrome. Okay. Certain other named syndromes which are associated with fragmentation hemolysis includes march hemolysis. Okay, so due to unknown causes, especially in soldiers who march for a very long time, you can have fragmentation hemolysis because of trauma. The vessels can get damaged and you can have hemolysis. This is called as march hemolysis. Then cardiac conditions can predispose to hemolysis, where especially if you have prosthetic heart valve. If you have a prosthetic heart valve, at that point in the prosthesis, the RBCs can undergo hemolysis, and this is a cardiac cause for fragmentation hemolysis. Then you can have consumption hemolysis, and this usually happens in, it's a very rare condition, it is usually children with large hemangiomas, and the hemangiomas in fact cause consumption of RBCs platelets, and there can be thrombocytopenia and microangiopathic hemolytic anemia. And this is what we call as the Kasabach-Merritt syndrome. Okay, so this is what we call as the Kasabach-Merritt syndrome, consumption hemolysis in hemangiomas. So now we will understand what is the difference between hemolytic uremic syndrome and thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura. So you have to remember the triad of HUS and the pentad of TTP. So what is the triad of HUS? It basically comprises of microangiopathic hemolytic anemia, where the peripheral smear shows the presence of schistocytes and there has been a drop in the hemoglobin. Apart from that, you will find evidence of thrombocytopenia. You will find evidence of thrombocytopenia and evidence of renal failure. and this is what we call as the triad of HUS, and it comprises of MAHA with thrombocytopenia and renal failure. Okay, why do you have renal failure here? Because the microangiopathic hemolytic anemia can also affect the small vessels of the kidney, causing renal failure. Now, TTP comprises of the same triad of HUS, that is MAHA along with renal failure, along with thrombocytopenia, along with two other symptoms which we call as the pentad, which includes the presence of neurological signs like altered sensorium and seizures, and with history of fever, right? So, you always remember this is the pentad of TTP. Okay, so always remember that TTP patients can present very similar to any kind of an acute febrile illness. They may be misdiagnosed to have sepsis, they may be misdiagnosed to have a rickettsial fever and so on because of AST-ALT elevation, because of thrombocytopenia, because of hemolysis. Okay, so the one catch point that you have to remember is that all of it can mimic a sepsis, but always look at the peripheral smear. Presence of schistocytes is definitely going to point towards a TTP or HUS, right? So this is the triad and pentad of HUS and TTP. So let us understand the important differences between childhood onset HUS and an adult onset hemolytic uremic syndrome. Okay, so let us understand in detail about HUS and then we will move on to TTP. So childhood onset HUS is usually associated with dysentery. It is usually associated with dysentery, but adult onset HUS is most often idiopathic. You will not know the cause and it has a sudden and explosive onset. So adult onset HUS is going to just present similar to a sepsis picture with fever, neurological involvement, renal failure, anemia, thrombocytopenia, any of which can happen in sepsis. Okay, fine. Childhood onset HUS is often secondary to infections and it has a preceding history of dysentery. The severity is often a milder severity in childhood onset HUS. In adult onset HUS, it is more and more severe. In childhood onset HUS, most often it is secondary to infections. What type of infections? You remember enterohemorrhagic E. coli, which is the strain O157H7, and it can also be due to Shigella infections. Okay, so infections, you have to remember childhood onset HUS. Familial causes and drugs are the most common causes, and genetic causes are the other important causes for adult HUS. So most commonly you have to remember complement factor H mutation, then complement factor B mutation, and MCP mutations are the other mutations which can be associated with adult onset HUS. Then remember this group of drugs which can cause adult onset HUS, which includes mitomycin, clopidogrel, paclitaxel, tacrolimus, cyclosporin. So all of these drugs can also cause adult onset HUS. So a patient of HUS in an adult, always remember to ask for these drug list and these kind of histories to ensure that there is no precipitating factor. Okay, so the prognosis is good in an childhood HUS, the prognosis is usually poor in adult onset HUS. So what are the investigations? Again, you will find evidence of hemolysis, you will find indirect hyperbilirubinemia, your peripheral smear, you will see the presence of schistocytes, right? So these are the important investigations. For treatment in childhood, you have to just give a conservative treatment, manage the hemolysis. Okay, you generally avoid antibiotics because it can worsen the HUS, so you just manage the children. Most of the time it is a self-limiting illness, but in adults they definitely require therapeutic plasma exchange. Okay, so they have to go for a therapeutic plasma exchange, and eculizumab has been tried for adult onset HUS as well. Okay, so this is about your childhood versus adult onset HUS. So what happens in TTP? How is TTP different? So in thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura, there are autoantibodies to ADAM-TS13. So ADAM-TS13 is basically a protein that prevents the over-organization of your von Willebrand factor multimers. So whenever there is an endothelial injury due to certain inciting factors, right? It can be due to infections, it can be due to drugs. So whenever there is an endothelial injury, what happens? In an endothelial injury, there is increased production of von Willebrand factor. The von Willebrand factor multiples coalesce together, and this further causes platelet clumping and it causes thrombocytopenia. At the same time, there is microangiopathic hemolytic anemia happening as well. So, there is hemolysis, there is anemia, there is thrombocytopenia. Okay. So, there can be autoantibodies to ADAMTS13. So, in such patients, again, it is a clinical suspicion. Apart from this, you may also do an ADAMTS13 levels and you will find those levels are definitely decreased. And the treatment again for TTP is plasma exchange. The patient will have to go for a PLEX. Alright. So, with this, we have come to the end of our discussion on non-immune hemolysis. Thank you.